The government of India has clarified its stance on Section 377 today, leaving the decision essentially to the apex court. The government has said it will not contest petitions challenging the law that criminalizes unnatural sex and impacts homosexuals as long as it applies to consensual acts of adults in private. Arpan Chaturvedi, who has been tracking the case, has more details of the government's response.
As soon as the hearing started, the Additional Solicitor General, Senior Advocate Tushar Mehta, came to court, and he presented the government stance as far as this question of constitutional validity of Section 377 is concerned. And what the government stance is now is that they have decided not to contest, and they have abstained from giving any opinion or taking any sides on this issue. But they have also made a certain clarification. What the government is saying is that as long as the court decides on the validity of constitutional validity of Section 377 of the IPC, which if struck down will in effect decriminalize homosexuality, the government will not contest that. But if this case also leads to a granting of specific other rights to the LGBTQ community, then in that case the government has said that they would like to reply and argue in this matter. So that has been one main outcome of this case. The other important point to be noted today is that the bench, which is headed by Justice Deepak Mishra, has made some broad observations hinting in more or less uncertain terms that the court will strike down Section 377. But of course, for the final word on that, we still need to wait once the hearing concludes and what will the final judgment will be of this 5-judge constitution bench of the Supreme Court.
You know what is very interesting about the government stance on Section 377 is that they have essentially left the decision to the Supreme Court after dithering over it. Remember, in 2013, when the Supreme Court had overturned the Delhi High Court's decision to repeal Section 377, the court had left it to Parliament to form laws on it. Parliament really didn't. No political party wanted to stick their neck out saying they support gay rights, though all of them said that Section 377 was unnecessary and should have been changed. The only member of Parliament who moved a private member's bill asking for the repealing of Section 377 was Shashi Tharoor, which is why today is a good day to speak with him. Thank you so much, Mr. Tharoor, for speaking with us here on Bloomberg Quint. Is it now correct to admit that politicians and political parties have completely failed in doing what was within their purview and repealing Section 377 within the legislature? It has now been left to the courts.
I think certainly there's a political failure on the part of the ruling party and the government in not stand for itself, but pushing the ball back in the court of the Supreme Court. And the fact is that neither side has covered itself with glory, because the decision of the Supreme Court two-judge bench in December 2013, which basically said this a Parliament to legislate, was itself a slightly odd decision, given that the Supreme Court has in many ways passed far-reaching judgments that have expanded the rights and freedoms of Indian citizens, such as, for example, on women's rights, women's inheritance, and so on, which clearly are the right things to do, because the court is also supposed to reflect the evolving patterns of society. So it would have been entirely appropriate for the court to uphold the Delhi High Court judgment of 2009, but it chose instead to kick the ball to Parliament. Parliament unfortunately proved incapable of playing with that ball, because the government didn't have the courage to act on the hints given to it by the Supreme Court. My attempts to introduce a private member's bill were defeated on two separate occasions by a rather bigoted and noisy set of BJP MPs on both occasions.
Mr. Tharoor, you talk about BJP MPs, but as I remember correctly, it was not as if MPs from your party supported you either when you moved that private member's bill. Does it not put all political parties in a precarious position, especially when governments turn around and accuse courts of judicial activism when they want courts to take care of tough subjects which they politically don't want to touch?
No, I don't accuse courts of judicial activism. I've actually, on the record, praised what the Supreme Court has done on women's rights between 2005 and 2015. There are 3 or 4 very significant judgments which have really expanded the realm of women's rights in a constructive direction. I think that's what judges should do. Their job is to interpret the Constitution. The Constitution guarantees a certain rights, but what the content of those rights are is very much for the judiciary to interpret in the light of changing social circumstances. So I am not a critic, but I would agree that where Parliament and the political parties can rise to their responsibilities, they should do so. They shouldn't just leave it to the judiciary. The judiciary steps in when the politicians leave a vacuum. So if the inability of the government, with its majority, to grapple with this issue manifests itself in this way, then of course the only hope is the judiciary. And when my two attempts to get Parliament to even discuss the issue failed, I myself wrote at that time that the only hope lies in a curative review petition. The only hope lies before the courts. And that, I'm afraid, is exactly where we have come out today. And I think it's in some ways a vindication of the vision of the founding fathers of our constitutional democracy, that they created these three branches, and what one can't do, sometimes the other is able to do. And let that be the way forward. The right to privacy, for example, is a very impressively far-reaching judgment, which in many ways will also inform the review of the petitions currently before the court on 377.
Sure. Okay, let's get back to 377. And Mr. Tharoor, if you've seen the representation that the government has made in court today, point 7 of it specifically, largely says that the government wants to leave the decision on 377 to the courts as long as it is about consensual sex between two private adults. But if the court goes into areas like property rights, marriage, adoption, etc., the government wants to weigh in. Do you think that will be the next big challenge for gay rights when they now want to formalize their relationships?
I think that would be an evolving issue. I mean, once 377 is read down and decriminalization happens, it simply restores to every citizen of India who's LGBTQ the rights that every other citizen of India already takes for granted. But when the question of how to apply those rights in specific circumstances arises, then very clearly you're going to have new laws that have to be written, new rules that have to be written. Marriage is a case in point. Right now, there is no provision for gay marriage in India. And it's entirely possible that some state or some judge or some magistrate might concur that the decriminalization of 377 permits it, and then somebody might say, but which rule permits it, and there might be a court case, and again, the issue may have to come before the judiciary. So I think it's going to be an evolving issue. I would agree with the literal language of the government affidavit that the reference before the courts and the petition before the courts is that a number of individuals feel that they are being deprived of their constitutional rights and freedoms by the fact that 377 is on the books. And they're asking for their constitutional rights and freedoms to be affirmed. Once the government affirms that, I don't disagree that it opens the door to other things, but I think it is not unreasonable of the government to imply that if it does formally open the door, there needs to be a larger process of deliberation and lawmaking. Because obviously, even in Western democracies, homosexuality was legal for decades before gay marriage was made legal, for example. So it's not in and of itself an automatic consequence, and there the government's affidavit is not inaccurate.
Mr. Tharoor, what is your own personal view on what seems to be logically the next step in the fight for gay rights, which would be on gay partnerships? What do you think about that?
I think gay partnerships, civil rights, civil partnership rights, the right to will property to a partner rather than necessarily to somebody recognized under existing laws, all of those things are entirely reasonable demands. Either the government can introduce a law making them legal, or if the government doesn't have the courage to do it, somebody will again go to court and it will come to the judiciary. But these are all evolving trends we have seen around the world, and it's India that is out of step with the majority of democracies on this issue. So I think we're going to head that way almost inevitably.
Thank you so much, Shashi Tharoor, for speaking with us, MP from Thiruvananthapuram from the Congress Party. One of the only MPs who had moved a private member's bill asking for the repealing of Section 377. Well, it's up to the courts to decide this now. The government today has made a stand clear, saying it will stay out of the way as long as it is just about consensual sex and does not extend beyond this to other rights, though it seems pretty clear that that would be the next step of the fight that gay rights activists have been fighting for.